The Great Depression left millions without adequate food, jobs, or security. Years before this took place, however, another depression in traditional habits had already started afflicting millions of people in the U.S., namely a crisis in its farm economy. Long ago, small family farmers typically had limited profitable income from farming. It wasn't lucrative to be one, but it worked well enough for feeding cities and more rural towns within the region. World War I, however, dramatically changed those traditional patterns of regional food provision. In Europe, many Europeans departed from their homes and onto or away from the battlefields, but this meant many of their farmers too. With less reliable food production to feed their populace and armies because of the war's disruptions, European countries turned to allies like the U.S. to feed them. In order to accomplish this, U.S. farmers began producing surplus food at a more massive scale by borrowing more money to pay for larger acreage and farm equipment. Once World War I began, it stimulated agricultural production into a rare prosperity. But then the war ended. Following post-war recovery, European farmers who returned home didn't require as much U.S. food anymore. Farmers had acquired a hefty debt, and some banks went out of business as a result of farmers not paying their loans. For a decade before the Great Depression hit the general populace, farmers created massive surplus in order to offset the falling price, on top of the surplus already created during the war, which was a self-reinforcing cycle. Farmers began to go bankrupt and their businesses were collapsing. Rural banks also collapsed and left thousands of customers out in the cold. When FDR was elected into office, he initiated the New Deal in 1933, enacting one of its first laws, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The intent was to restore purchasing power of commodity crops to pre-World War I levels, specifically 1909 to 1914. Farmers were told to limit their production levels. Those farmers that agreed to the limits were paid a subsidy. As many farmers were in desperate fear for their families being evicted from their land, they eagerly accepted and received checks from the government to pay their debts and taxes. However, there was still the problem of what to do with all the surplus goods. The government took its newly purchased products and began policies like the Hog Reduction Program, introduced by the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, leading to the death and disposal of over 6 million hogs. Millions more of healthy cows and sheep were also slaughtered and buried in mass graves. This strategy paid off. By 1935, farmers' income generated upwards of 50% higher than in 1932. The Agricultural Adjustment Act eventually was ruled unconstitutional by a conservative anti-New Deal Supreme Court. But it was revitalized through various subsequent programs and has since evolved into a permanent law. To this day, the government still enacts mandatory subsidization through the currently named Agricultural Act of 2014.